Good morning. Welcome to the Disability Task Force Toolkit Review webinar. My name is Will O'Neill. I'm the Director of Continuity of Operations and Emergency Management for the Health and Human Services Commission. I've been a member of the Disability Task Force for a number of years, and we appreciate the opportunity and TDEM hosting the conversation this morning. We also have Ron Lucy. Ron, if you would introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Ron Lucy. I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Governor's Committee on People with Disabilities. Our agency is a member of the Texas Disability Task Force, and I'll be presenting on the Effective Communications Toolkit this morning.
So as we begin, make sure we're good and covered down on any technical issues with the webinar. We do have Rosemary McKnight with Texas Division of Emergency Management who's covering any questions as they come in. Everything looks good so far. If y'all have any audio issues, any issues looking at the slides, please let us know. We want to make sure that this is a relevant and a good overview of these two toolkits for all of our partners that are off-site for the webinar, as well as those who have joined us in the room. So thank you for being here again this morning. Our goal today is to look at the two toolkits that the Disability Task Force has created over the years. We're going to explore the best practices for communicating with members of the disability community. So as we set the groundwork for this, when we're talking about effective communication, we are really focusing in on functional needs support services with a specific direction on supporting individuals with disabilities. So those that are identified by the Americans with Disabilities Act. We also understand that a lot of these tools, as they've been created, are functional and can help support communication with other individuals that might have low English proficiency as well. But the specific goal is in support of individuals with disabilities. We're also going to be exploring the FNSS toolkit. As Mr. Lucy mentioned, he'll talk mostly about the Effective Communications toolkit. The FNSS toolkit is a preparedness guidance, so it goes over opportunities to plan, train, exercise, orient, and work together with the community, but also an operational tool. The world that we live in is ever and consistently changing. We want these tools to be real, viable operational guidance that can meet the needs of individuals with disabilities in our shelter populations, and going beyond that, a lot of the tools here can be utilized during other operations. So points of distribution, points of dispensing, utilizing them as embarkation points during evacuation. It is reaching the needs with communication, with access, with coordination for that whole community aspect, again, with that focus on people with disabilities. So ultimately, as we work through this process today in the next 2 hours, we hope we are able to meet these goals. I think we can. I'm going to go over a couple important definitions to begin with, helping align us to the definitions utilized by our partners in the federal government and our partners within TDEM and locally. What are we talking about as we look at these toolkits? One is whole community. So I'm not going to read through this process. It's sitting down with everybody, having that opportunity in your preparedness model, right? That 99% of the time we're in a world of preparedness, having those conversations beforehand, because when the response happens, then you'll have a better opportunity for success. Absolutely. So do we do a good job of integrating and having that conversation with our whole community? And the answer is it depends. Are you willing to step out of sometimes your comfort area and have some of those hard conversations? As emergency managers, that is our goal, is to support our community. And our community is varied. So in order to meet that whole community process and program, we have to be engaged in some of those conversations throughout the life cycle of emergency management. People with access and functional needs. So what is an access and functional need? Something beyond the quote normal, right? So in the world of a disaster response, everybody has additional need, right? One of my favorite mentors in emergency management was Rick Bays, who was with the Department of State Health Services. Many of you on the phone here remember Rick. Rick unfortunately passed a couple of years ago, but we were working on these toolkits together, and we started talking about being oxygen dependent. Well, what population is oxygen dependent? Well, we all are, right? So we all need oxygen, but some people need additional support through concentrators or the provision of O2 tanks in order to successfully take in that oxygen, right? So again, who are vulnerable populations during disasters? We're all vulnerable, but during that disaster, what is that additional need that somebody might have? And frankly, people with disabilities, individuals who are elderly, children, they are potentially more prone to having an access and functional need, but they might not have one. Somebody who is 75 years old, they're part of our elder population, but they might be fully able to take care of themselves. Or maybe in the context of their home they are, but now that they've moved into that shelter environment, they need some additional support. And that's what our goal is to help meet the needs of the individuals post-disaster in an equitable process.
By focusing on functional and access needs instead of a specific disability, it lightens your load for specialized knowledge. You don't have to know about asthma or COPD or different types of disabilities to understand what the functional and access needs are for people who are oxygen dependent. You don't need to know about retinitis pigmentosa or glaucoma or cataracts to understand how to help people with low vision or people who are blind. So these toolkits take that functional and access need philosophy and make it manageable for you in terms of an information load.
Thank you, Ron. So the Disability Integration Task Force, we have Dr. Laura Stow here from Texas A&M University, who is the new current chair of the task force. This task force has been together and been a team that's worked together on integrating some concepts of supporting individuals with disabilities since 2011. And it was not done in a context of, okay, the great state of Texas or Texas A&M partners and only state agencies involved. It's also included the disability community. So there's a term that they use, nothing about us without us. And so as part of this disability task force, the work that's being done is asking representatives from disability groups and communities throughout the state, what works? What basically works for the needs to help that conversation move forward, to help support emergency management and public health during disaster response, for those organizations to take back that same information and communicate to their communities. Texas Association of the Deaf is one of those key partners that has been very active and involved and has gone back to their community to talk to them about what to expect during disaster response. Because the level of expectation among our general population and the reality of disaster, a shelter in a disaster, can sometimes be a little bit dissimilar, if you will. So an opportunity for those conversations to happen, bringing in that perspective and that communication. So the Disability Task Force continues its good work, helping support Texas Division of Emergency Management. Ron, with the Governor's Committee on People with Disabilities, is very involved, as well as other state agencies. But not only the state agencies and those groups that represent people with disabilities, but also local communities, right? So what is real? What is real for the community of Austin, Texas is different than what is real for Harris County, which is different than El Paso, right? We all have different nuances and details. The purpose of the Disability Task Force is at the state level to have some of those conversations and help enhance the opportunity for you all at the local level to have those same conversations. Does it reflect the needs for the city of Eagle Pass? Is that the same as Amarillo? So working together, helping promote the preparedness efforts of Texans with disabilities, and again, working for that partnership. So kind of an open invitation. If anybody's interested in listening to these conversations and participating in these conversations, this is another opportunity to listen, have an opportunity to identify best practices. So who's done a good job of it? We like to point out our partners at Corpus Christi. This was an opportunity that we've seen that they've had those conversations in the preparedness model, and frankly, that was well reflected in the response during Hurricane Harvey. So we went from tropical storm, 5 to 10 inches of water, let's double that for our current planning scenario, kind of worst case, early on the morning of early that week. Within 2 days, we progressed through not only the tropical storm situation and impact, but now it's going to be a hurricane. So we're talking about damaging winds aimed right at Corpus Christi, potential storm surge, those impacts, those cascading events, power outages, all the way up to a major hurricane, right? Category 4 hurricane. Now, for Corpus, the storm didn't have huge impact. It actually hit Rockport, destroyed the city of Rockport, right? And then went on to inundate Houston and Beaumont, Port Arthur area. And the state of Texas was in rapid response and search and rescue for approximately a week and a half of unprecedented response in an emergency situation. But Corpus Christi their evacuation, their coordination, their communications was integrated, and they brought these partners to the table. Not only from local government, but the Coastal Bend Council for Independent Living. They brought in deaf and hard of hearing center specialists, Texas A&M University Disability Services, 211 Texas, and their own Office of Emergency Management. We're having these conversations years in advance for planning purposes. So they organize this work group, they equip this work group with the opportunity to engage with those partners, they trained together, they exercised together, face-to-face, being in the room, having the opportunity to reflect on, hey, what went well, what did not go well, and then they evaluated the outcomes of that and improved their planning process. So working through that POETI cycle, when we had disaster response, we saw success in Corpus Christi with integration in support of the whole community and supporting the people who had disabilities there. And again, Corpus Christi is a unique city in and of itself, right? So a good opportunity to reflect on that prospect. Now, we also like to use Corpus Christi because they are mid-size, right? Some of the challenges they have are not the same that our partners in Houston, Harris County or Austin, Travis County have. And in some cases, those larger jurisdictions might have more resources to point towards these response activities. Or in the smaller jurisdictions, right? We know Uncle Joe and Aunt Sue are hard of hearing. So if there's a tornado watch or warning going on, somebody's looking out for them. Good opportunity. These mid-range cities and organizations have to work as hard as any of them. But looking out for each other, having that opportunity for a conversation, working through the model showed success with our partners at Corpus Christi. So where can you find the toolkits? The toolkits are located on Preparing Texas, both the Effective Communications Toolkit and the FNSS Toolkit. So, but preparingtexas.org, if you go to the Preparing Texas website, you can find these both the toolkits under the preparedness link. And then who do the toolkits apply to? So everybody, it really does apply to everybody, but they were specifically tailored to support local jurisdiction, first responders, emergency management professionals, public information officers, shelter managers, anybody involved in state and local government. So do we have to be supportive of reasonable accommodations to meet the needs of our citizens on a regular basis? What's the answer? Yeah, we do. Do we have to do that when the emergency happens or in preparation for the emergency? The answer is absolutely yes, right? So it's meeting those needs, it's being engaged in these conversations. We use these same toolkits in conversations with state agency partners. As we work through the slideshow, you're going to see some of those successes, where we started off during the Bastrop fires with limited sign language interpreter service with the governor to there is always a sign language interpreter with the governor during our responses. And that helps meet the needs of the community. So again, being involved, being engaged, and understanding these toolkits at the preparedness process, this will help with your preparedness and planning, and as operational tools. And again, point of emphasis on that. The toolkits are pretty long, 150 pages or so each. You know, that's a lot to sit down and read all the way through. But take a look at the beginning where it talks about preparedness integration. Take a look through the tools. You don't have to memorize them. These were built in a way so that you could have a hard copy of the toolkits readily available to utilize during the disaster, during the response. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Lucy to go into some details on the Effective Communications Toolkit.
Thank you, Will. The Effective Communications Toolkit's primary purpose is to help make sure that your emergency communications meet the functional and access needs of people with disabilities. You do not use this toolkit like you would read a novel. It's reference material. And it's well organized so that you can drop into each section. If you're working with your elected official to plan a news conference, you can drop into that section. If you're wanting to make sure that your shelter managers know how to interact in a one-on-one live interaction with people with disabilities in the shelter, you can drop into Chapter 5. So there's it's got a lot of utility. As Will suggested, you can download it to your phone using a QR code. I encourage you to have a hard copy, since we know that you can have outages of websites and power, so it's good to have a copy on hand. So what is effective communication? It's the first step in providing information to people with functional and access needs during an emergency. means that people with disabilities can have access to the same information as people without disabilities in terms of timeliness and quality. If there's a live broadcast taking place that's describing a weather emergency, and there's a crawl going along the bottom of the screen that's telling people what areas that they need to take immediate shelter, that same information needs to be provided to people who have a vision impairment, people who are legally blind, using either the weather announcers describing the information that's in the crawl, or there needs to be an audible alert that tells people to tune to a separate broadcast like radio, or use the secondary audio channel on their television to get that information. So the information needs to be accessible, understandable, and timely. And we're going to get into those definitions, what is meant by accessible. All of you understand how accessibility works in the built environment. You've been, ever since the passage of the ADA in 1990, you're familiar with accessible buildings like the building that we're in now, all the way from the accessible parking lot with handicap parking, accessible restrooms with grab bars, no-step entrances into the building. But today we're going to be talking about accessibility for information and communications technology, which is something that many people are less familiar with. And we'll get into specifically what you can do to make sure that that happens in your organization. So accessibility is the law. In the, whether you're with city or county government or with a state agency, there's a law that covers your responsibilities for accessibility. The three primary laws are, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act, specifically Title II of the ADA, which applies to state agencies and local government. There's also a law that applies to state agencies, Texas Government Code 2054, Subchapter M, which is simply a copy and paste of Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is the federal law that required that those federal agencies make their websites and their digital communications accessible. That law was copied by the Texas legislature back in 2005 and applies to all state agencies and state colleges and universities. And of course, as I mentioned, Section 508 of the Rehab Act, not only is it a collection of coding standards that apply to state agencies and federal agencies, but it's also been used by the Justice Department as the standard that they apply to private entities and to local government when they're talking about website accessibility. So, as I mentioned, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II of the ADA, is a civil rights law. It's a lot of people misunderstand what the ADA is. It's not an entitlement law that gives people with disabilities stuff. It's a law that's intended to level the playing field for people with disabilities and ensure that people with disabilities have equal access not only to information through effective communications, but also equal access to programs and services. Requires that all local governments and state agencies ensure that their communications are accessible. And as we talked about, accessible not only means equivalent in terms of quality of information, but also equal access to the timeliness of the information. If you're providing live access to current information and you tell people with disabilities they need to go to an out-of-date website for information, that's not considered equal access. And then, of course, equal access to programs and services. Well, you often don't think of emergency management as a program for the public, but of course it is. And ensuring that people with disabilities have the same access to emergency management services as the general public. None of you as planners would make a plan that only addresses the needs of 5/6 of the population. And here in Texas, approximately 3.4 million Texans have a disability. That's roughly 1/6 of the population. So as you develop your emergency plans, you're going to ensure that your communication parts of your plans meet the needs of the whole community, as Mr. O'Neill said, including people with disabilities. Then, of course, supporting the use of auxiliary aids and services. The toolkit will get into what exactly that is. Services can include things like American Sign Language interpreters or real-time captioning. And then when we talk about auxiliary aids, we're going to talk about various types of assistive technologies that are either used by people with disabilities or the types of auxiliary aids that you can use in your emergency management services. Okay, so going through the toolkit, chapter 2 is the chapter that provides general guidance on effective communications, including getting into exactly what is meant by accessibility, what steps to take before an incident occurs. As Will mentioned, this is a toolkit that you should reference and become familiar with before the next hurricane, and I'm glad we're doing this in April before hurricane season really takes off. But the time to pick up this toolkit for the first time is not during the next disaster, but to really become familiar with it now, because there's going to be some conversations you're going to have within your jurisdiction, including conversations with local media. We're going to cover what is meant by people first language, which is a communication philosophy that allows you to communicate with respect and communicate effectively with people with disabilities. We'll talk about plain language as a writing skill and a writing technique. We'll talk about multimodal communication. As emergency managers, you would never use a single approach to anything you do. We've heard one is none and two is one, having redundancies, and that's true for communication. And then we'll get into some more specific detail about how to make things like charts, graphs, and graphics accessible in your communications. So what is accessibility? Accessibility, as I mentioned, in terms of accessibility of information and communication technology, is making sure that people with disabilities have access to the same information, can perform the same tasks or the same functionality, and achieve the same goals or outcome as people without disabilities. And that's something we would expect for any of our customers. People with disabilities may use different means to access information. I'm a person with a disability. I have a vision impairment. I'm regarded as legally blind. And when I access a website, I do it in a different way than you might do it. I use technology that reads the website out loud to me using a tool called a screen reader. I also use another tool called a screen magnification program that enlarges the display of text on the screen and allows me to navigate more easily. But the bottom line is we're accessing the same information, the same content. We may just do it in a different way. So it's important for you to check your documents and accessibility before a disaster. There are changes you can make during a disaster, ensuring that you have American Sign Language interpreters for news conferences. But the steps that we're talking about in this toolkit and the training that's available really needs to be implemented now. Many of you on the call or in the room may not be the technical person for your jurisdiction, but go out and meet your webmaster. I was talking to Bill in the publications unit of TDEM and encouraging him to be familiar with his agency's web accessibility coordinator. Every state agency is required by law to have a web accessibility coordinator, and local jurisdictions, city and county government, has a webmaster. And that webmaster, in order to be effective at their job, also needs to know about web accessibility. You wouldn't hire an architect to build a building if they didn't know how to ensure that the building was accessible with no-step entrances and ramps and accessible restrooms and hallways that are wide enough for a person to get through with a wheelchair. Likewise, you wouldn't want to have a webmaster for your local jurisdiction that doesn't know the techniques of making your website accessible. And it's a skill the same as any other skill, but it's a skill that can be learned, and this toolkit provides you with links to valuable training that can help you acquire those skills before a disaster. There's also testing tools out there to help you test your documents for accessibility. Going back to Microsoft Office 2010, Microsoft began including an accessibility checker to help you check your Word documents and your PowerPoint presentations and Excel documents for accessibility. That's something you can do now. Then, of course, making sure that training is available. We've taken a valuable step by providing all of state government and really all of the state of Texas with free accessibility training on the governor's website. If you go to gov.texas.gov/disabilities, you'll find a link to Microsoft Office accessibility training. And my predecessor, Angie English, called those coffee break videos. They're short 7 to 10 minute videos that allow you to learn a basic skill of accessibility on how to make sure that your office documents are accessible. The training was developed by 13 different state agencies, and it was so well done, the Federal Communications Commission gave it an Innovation Award. We've always believed that the taxpayer shouldn't have to pay for the same good idea more than once, and so why not all collaborate together to provide this sort of training so that it can meet the needs of multiple agencies. So we talked about what are the regulations or the rules for accessibility, and of course I mentioned Section 508 of the Rehab Act, which is a regulation that's governed by the United States Access Board. Back in 1998, when the Section 508 of the Rehab Act was first passed, it was a list of accessibility standards that applied to things like telephone systems and copy machines and fax machines and computers, desktop computers, and also websites. But if you think back to 1998 when those rules passed, if you had a phone, more than likely it had an antenna that pulled out that was about 1 foot long. Your phone probably was as heavy as a brick, and it had 20 minutes of talk time. And it was a phone. That's all it could do was make phone calls. Well, as technology advances, our standards need to advance as well. And it was long overdue for Section 508 of the Rehab Act to be updated and keep pace with the changes in technology. Meanwhile, the private sector had developed a set of web content accessibility guidelines, and these standards are known as WCAG, or in the version that I'm referencing is WCAG 2.0. What you need to know about WCAG is that it's an international standard that is used not just here in North America, but Europe and Asia, and that this standard has been adopted by the Justice Department and the Access Board, and is also recommended by the Department of Information Resources. So about a year ago, they put out a final rule saying that WCAG will be the new standard for Section 508 of the Rehab Act. So as you communicate with your webmaster in your jurisdiction and say, hey, how are we doing on making sure that our website emergency information is accessible? And are you familiar with WCAG 2.0? That's really the conversation that you need to have to make sure that they understand what those standards are. So I want to provide a quick, simple example to make accessibility of information and communication technology understandable to you if you're not a technical person. Let's take a simple example like email. In the toolkit, the Effective Communication Toolkit talks about how to ensure that office documents, including email, is accessible. And a lot of you have colleagues that use pretty busy stationery in their email. They may also use a decorative font, something like a cursive font or a Comic Sans, something like that. In order to make sure that your communications is able to be understood by everybody, we encourage you to just pick a simple black text font with a white background, avoid complex stationery with busy backgrounds, and make sure that you use good structure in your communications, use heading styles, but also if you have images in your email communication, you can put some code in there. If you right-click on the image, you can add what's called alt text or alternative text. It's essentially a text description of the image. There's a saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but most of the pictures we use in our communications shouldn't take 1,000 words to describe it. So if you have, for example, a pie chart that describes the budget for your agency, that can generally be described in 3 or 4 sentences describing what ratio of each slice of the pie represents how much of the budget for each program area. Likewise, I mentioned that we provide training and reference material in the toolkit for how to make Microsoft Office documents accessible. In the toolkit, you'll find the link that I mentioned to the Office training videos on the governor's website. And the toolkit covers basic techniques like ensuring that your documents use styles in Microsoft Word for structure. For people that have a vision impairment, people that use a screen reader, as I mentioned I do, when they go to a website or they go to a large Microsoft Word document, they scan that document in the same way that you, when you read a newspaper, you don't read everything from top to bottom and left to right. Your eyes go from heading to heading looking for the content that you are interested in, that you want to read. In the same way, a person using assistive technology would do that, but only if those headings are applied using styles. If you take text and you simply highlight it and make it bigger, you take it from 12-point Arial to 16-point Arial bold, that isn't necessarily a heading. Visually it looks like a heading, but unless you use the style formatting tools in Microsoft Word to style it as a heading, the code won't be there to let the assistive technology know that it's a heading and allow you to navigate. It's a pretty simple concept, but it's the difference between something looking like it's accessible and something actually being accessible. Also, tabular data. We have seen tables that can be visually confusing to people with an intellectual disability or just the general public that have multiple rows of column headers. And the recommendation that we give you is to keep your tables simple. And if you're going to use a complex table, you might want to break it into more than one table to convey the same information. Okay, accessible presentations is another area addressed by the toolkit. And hopefully this is information that we applied for this presentation. One of the first things you need to do when giving a public presentation, whether it's at a center where you're inviting the public to access FEMA benefits, or you're doing a town meeting to inform the public about what they need to do in response to a disaster, the first thing you want to do is make sure that the location of where you're holding that meeting is accessible. And this is something that you need to do in advance. A lot of public facilities, City Hall, public schools, those sort of places generally are accessible because they've been required to follow the Americans with Disabilities Act in advance. But knowing that the place where you're holding your presentation or your meeting is accessible can be done by accessing some of the checklists in the toolkit. You need to also include in your meeting invitation whether somebody has an accommodation need. It may be that you have a member of your audience who has a hearing impairment and needs real-time captioning to be able to understand what the speaker is saying, or maybe somebody needs an American Sign Language interpreter. And then, of course, making sure that the materials that you're sharing is accessible. At the end of Will's presentation and my presentation, we can provide this PowerPoint presentation to any one of you, and it's been prepared in a way that's accessible. So if you want to share it with people in your community, you don't have to worry that the text descriptions aren't there, the page titles are read properly, and that everything in the presentation is accessible. Then, of course, speaking slowly and clearly, making sure that you describe important graphics that are up on the screen. The image on this slide is just eye candy. It's not critical that we describe a picture of somebody pointing to an audience, but there will be some graphics and presentations that you need to describe to the audience in case you have a member of your audience who has a vision impairment. Okay, so I mentioned in Chapter 2 that the toolkit goes into a communication philosophy and etiquette called People First, Respectful Language. People First is not political correctness. It's a communication philosophy and an approach that really simplifies how you communicate with people with disabilities. It's hard to keep up with. Is it people with special needs? Is it people who are handicapped? What is the current term? And so People First, Respectful Language simplifies that approach for you and allows you to make sure that whenever you communicate, you're doing it appropriately and respectfully. It's a philosophy that puts the person before their disability, rather than the disabled or the autistic. It takes the person, puts them ahead of their disability, and it makes it an individual with a disability or an individual with autism. It also avoids terminology that may be offensive to people, that's greatly out of date. It avoids terms that are intended to evoke pity or sympathy, but do it at the expense of the individual's dignity. Using terms like a person who suffers with autism or suffers with Down syndrome or is afflicted with epilepsy, those sort of terms that create a barrier between you and your audience, either intentionally or unintentionally. It's not the way that you need to communicate with essentially 1/6 of the population. So on this screen, there's a cartoon, and it has a person, and it says, how would you like to be referred to, as handicapped, special needs, and the person says, I'd prefer to be known as Joe. And essentially, that's what we're getting at. You don't need to use a disability label for somebody that you're interacting with unless it's relevant to the conversation. Most people with disabilities are, as I mentioned, people first, and don't need a label. Okay, so a couple of other tips. Emphasize abilities, not limitations. We're going to avoid those negative words that evoke tragedy or pity, such as afflicted with or suffering with a disability. And we're going to talk about what people have rather than what type of disability labels them. He's an individual who has a learning disability rather than he's learning disabled. And then often cringeworthy, we hear about people that are wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. A wheelchair is a tool that provides independence and liberates an individual with a disability. It's not something that they're bound to, so using terminology like that can also create a barrier to establishing a rapport between you and a person with a disability. Another technique covered in the toolkit, which is something that all of us can benefit from in our professional lives, is the concept of plain language. In the toolkit, it references plainlanguage.gov, which is a federal website that is a repository of best practices for writing in plain language. Now, every profession deserves its professional jargon, and certainly the profession of emergency management is not immune to professional jargon. And that professional jargon is essentially a shorthand between you and your peers to create quick understanding. However, the general public is not tuned into the jargon of emergency management, and we've often seen in emergencies when emergency managers begin to communicate with the public using their professional jargon, it can create barriers to understanding. For example, if you say that there's a red flag warning and that people should take caution due to the high winds that are in the area, that term red flag warning may not mean anything to people who are deaf because in American Sign Language, red flag is not how they would describe a high risk for fire and high winds that could quickly spread that fire. The general public may not be immediately aware of what a red flag warning is. So using plain language, there are high winds and dry conditions that could result in risk of wildfires. Be careful and don't have any outdoor fires. Terms like deploying a strike team to the Gulf Coast, does that sound like you're going to be delivering MREs and ice and bottled water, or does that sound like something that may not be as welcoming? So thinking about the terminology that we use is just a small part of plain language. Plain language is really much more than that. It also makes sure that the individual understands the meaning of the communication the first time they read it, and uses techniques like formatting, using bulleted lists to chunk information into understandable chunks as opposed to long, complex, compound sentences. So formatting can help greatly ease the understanding for people that are trying to understand information using plain language. Using active voice instead of passive voice. There's just a whole bunch of techniques, and when you review the plain language section, you'll say, I think that this is something I could use just to improve my professional communication with my peers, along with improving your emergency communications with your community. Multimodal warnings and techniques is also covered in Chapter 2, and I want to go to some examples in Hurricane Harvey where this was critical. There were areas of the state that were affected by the high winds and flooding where 2 out of the 3 TV stations in that community were no longer broadcasting. And the remaining station in a particular community was having problems with its real-time captioning, where the information coming across the caption was garbled, and the local elected official was not using an American Sign Language interpreter. Likewise, that same area of the state did not have text to 911 capability, where people who are deaf would be able to communicate with a 911 operator using a text device. In a situation like that, people are going to go to the best mode of communication that works for them. And for the deaf community, that was largely social media. And so if you're putting all your eggs in one basket for communication, relying on broadcast communication through local TV stations or radio communication, you may be missing an important portion of your community. For Texans who are deaf, roughly 4% of our population is deaf, and that is actually a pretty significant number. Think of the population of Houston, over 3 million people there, and you're talking about tens of thousands of people who are deaf that may not be getting the information they need to respond appropriately to flooding or to a hurricane if we're not using multimodal communication. So multimodal communication in the toolkit describes about using those multiple channels. There are examples in the toolkit about using different modes of communication, but also ensuring that your single mode of communication is accessible. One best practice that we saw during Hurricane Harvey were some videos developed by FEMA. And these videos used an American Sign Language interpreter that was a certified deaf interpreter. The person that was doing the interpreting was deaf, and they were essentially a native speaker. American Sign Language is not English, and the syntax of American Sign Language and the vocabulary is unique to that population, and so using a native speaker really improved the quality of the communication. Those FEMA videos also used voiceover English, so that people who were watching the video with a family member who was deaf, or were just general public that was watching the video, could get the same information. And then of course it had captioning, not closed captioning, but open captioning, so that a person who excuse me, has a hearing loss but doesn't know American Sign Language would be able to have the same access to the information as anyone else. So there's an example of multimodal communication where in the same communication piece, an informational video, we covered the needs of people who are deaf, people who are hard of hearing, people who are hearing but need or may be blind or have low vision, who need the information in an audio fashion. Okay, so the toolkit also provides you with suggested accommodation statements. And as I mentioned, this is both a good practice if you're holding public meetings, but also good information to include on your website if people are not able to get the information they need and they have a way to reach back to you. Essentially, the statement describes the agency, gives a statement of your policy on accessibility, and then says, if you still have problems, contact us. And hopefully that contact information that you put is either a monitored mailbox or a monitored phone number. Generally, in the agencies I've worked for, these sort of statements lead back to either the Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator or the Web Accessibility coordinator. And it's monitored by a department or a team of individuals who, when they get contact from a person with a disability, they can respond quickly and provide them with access to the same information that they may have a barrier to, but through alternate means. And those alternate means can include something as simple as reading the information to them over the telephone, helping them fill out a form over the phone, providing them with an alternate format than the one that they're trying to access through your website. Give you a quick example. Recently I heard from an individual that was trying to access a form to request a ballot by mail for absentee voting. And they said that they were having accessible barriers. So we went to the Secretary of State's site, and the form looked great. I mean, it was clear fonts, and when I opened it in Adobe Reader, it said this document is tagged for correct reading order, but there was just one problem with the form. It was not fillable. You could not type on it. You had to print it and fill it out with a ballpoint pen or a pencil. And for a person who's blind, that's not something they were going to able to do independently. And even for people with manual dexterity challenges, whether it be carpal tunnel syndrome or cerebral palsy, who cannot fill out information using pen or pencil and need to use a keyboard to do that, that form was not accessible. Good news is that agency, when informed of the problem, quickly fixed the problem. They had the form accessible within 24 hours, and it gave them an opportunity to examine their internal processes and look at any forms that they post on their website that are not fillable and go back and fix that situation. Okay, so Chapter 3 is a chapter that gets into specific types of communications and how to make them accessible, like alerts and warnings and notifications, written communication, videos, social media, and meetings. And then finally, face-to-face communication. Throughout your lives, whether it be on the weekend when you and your family are traveling in public, going to church, going to a mall, or in your professional life at work, you're going to likely interact with people with disabilities all the time. And the simple question is, what's the appropriate way to interact with those people with disabilities? And this chapter gives you specific skill sets to know how to handle interpersonal interactions. So first of all, we're going to talk about planning ahead with local media. We talked about how there were some challenges during Hurricane Harvey, and I know as we do after action, we always focus on what went wrong more than what went right. And for the vast majority of broadcast communications, a lot went really right. As Will said, Governor Abbott and all of his news conferences at the State Operations Center, he always used an American Sign Language interpreter. It was a professional certified interpreter, and more importantly, the interpreter was kept inside the camera shot. The interpreter, you probably didn't notice, they wear clothing that's a contrasting color, and they try to use a background that's a dark single color contrasting background so that the hands and the arms can be seen by an audience who's deaf. It's important for you to consult with your local media right now before the next disaster strikes and remind them of their responsibilities under the Federal Communication Commission for communicating effectively with people with disabilities during a disaster. Most stations are aware of their responsibility, but the toolkit gets into the specifics of exactly what they need to do and how they need to do it. Live broadcast briefings, as we mentioned, use different techniques. American Sign Language interpreters are one of them. Real-time captioning is another. And then, of course, we're familiar with the crawl going across the bottom of the station. Making sure that information is multimodal. If you have information in the crawl, making sure that it's also spoken by the broadcaster so that people who have a vision impairment or a reading disability are able to understand the same information that's being included in the crawl. Make sure that you have good captioning services and test those. As we mentioned, there was one broadcast station during Harvey who didn't realize that their captioning was garbled. Nonsense was coming out during the news conferences, and so, as I mentioned, 4% of the population, people who are deaf, were not getting the information they needed. Then, of course, describing visual information. If you say the counties that are in red need to take immediate shelter because there's a tornado warning and they should seek immediate shelter. There are members of our public who are colorblind, and if you say the counties in red or the neighborhoods that are red on the map on the screen, that's not enough information for people who are colorblind, and so you need to verbally identify those counties. And of course, this picture up here, my boss, Governor Greg Abbott, in the State Operations Center with an American Sign Language interpreter. Okay, so face-to-face meetings. We talked about how this chapter discusses face-to-face communication with people with disabilities. And this is something where you may not always be comfortable. If you see an individual with a disability and you think that they need help and you want to come up and assist them, you may not be comfortable or even sure how to help. But The good news is anytime you interact with a person with a disability, there's already one expert in that relationship on how to assist that person with a disability, and that is, of course, the person with the disability. So the best thing you can do as a professional is just simply ask, how can I assist you? And that is true both in interpersonal interactions, but that's also true for planning and emergency management. If you want to know how to best assist people with disabilities in your community, you need to engage with them in advance. We talked about how there's a disability task force at the state level, and our disability task force encourages you to establish local functional and access need committees to make sure you're asking people with disabilities how they can best be assisted in their community, both before and after a disaster. So in the toolkit, it gets into specific interaction techniques for different types of disabilities. Interacting with people who have a hearing loss or hard of hearing. This is sometimes hard to do in emergency situations, especially in a crowded, noisy shelter. But when interacting with a person who's hard of hearing, it's important for you to try to find the quietest area possible and have a clear line of sight between you and the person. They may have some residual hearing, but also be able to read lips. Don't chew gum, or even individuals with mustaches. It may be hard for a person who's hard of hearing to understand what they're saying. So try to keep your mouth clear and have a clear line of sight. Make sure you get their attention. Come up and tap them on the shoulder, and make sure that they can see you and know that you're trying to get their attention. Clear view of your face is important. And then, of course, speak clearly at a moderate pace, but you don't have to shout. It's important to, if they're not understanding, repeat yourself and maybe even use different words. Like instead of saying the bus is going to be evacuating people at 15 minutes after the hour, you can then say a quarter after the hour if they didn't understand 15. Of course, communicating with people who are deaf in sign language, the toolkit gives you specific resources for making sure that you're hiring a qualified interpreter, and HHSC's Office of Deaf or Hard of Hearing Services can help your jurisdiction establish interpreter contracts before the next disaster. They have a list of interpreter agencies throughout the state of Texas, and they've established contract templates to where you can work through them to get an interpreter contract. It's important to use qualified interpreters. It's very tempting to use family members, and certainly during an emergency you're going to use whatever resource you have on hand. But when it comes to especially news conferences and broadcast communications, using a qualified interpreter service, making sure that you're using the appropriate level. There are different levels of interpreters, level 2, 3, and 4, and the more complex and technical the information, the higher level of certification you need for that interpreter. One of the things you can do is offer note takers. If you have a member of your audience who's meeting with you, offer them the notes at the end of the presentation or the meeting to make sure that they got all the information that everybody else got. And then just keeping language simple. Try to keep the information as basic as possible so that a person who's deaf gets the same level of understanding as anybody else. Okay, so the toolkit has a lot of information in the appendix and also in this chapter on talkboards and pictograms. Pictograms are a type of graphical communication that helps people with low English literacy, or people with an intellectual disability, or even people who are deaf or hard of hearing understand visually information that might be communicated in text communication or verbally. And there's a lot of sample pictograms that you can print out from the toolkit. There are links to high-quality PDFs of these pictograms that you can print out and use in shelters, or just point to in the toolkit when you're interacting with an individual.
So Ron, real quick on this one, the example, excuse me, the example pictogram here has shelter rules, and one of them is no animals, right? So what's a potential exception for that?
Ostriches.
Somebody said ostriches. Thanks. And that's not what I was looking for.
People with disabilities have to have
Service animals, right? So if this was posted up in the shelter, there might need to have an opportunity to deconflict with an individual who sees this and says, oh man, that means I can't bring my service animal in. That's a problem. So while pictograms are good, sometimes there needs to be some additional communication, an opportunity always for shelter managers, for staff during the emergency response, during the first response, when you're evacuating a building, whatever it is pictograms with a follow-up. We need to make sure our folks are being analytical and thoughtful in those conversations, and that's where it goes back to just ask. You see somebody with an animal, it looks like they might be vested or coming in, and they're with that animal, clarifying, hey, you can still come into the shelter with that service animal. And as a point of fact, most of our shelters are pet friendly too, right? So this might not be ubiquitous throughout the organization, but this is a Red Cross document. So again, making sure there's some clarification, adapting your tools to the operational conditions in which you find yourself.
There's another type of animal that shelter managers may encounter, emotional support animals, and although they're not covered in the same legal way as a service animal, an emotional support animal is covered by the Fair Housing Act, and its mere presence is intended to give comfort to a person who may have a psychiatric disability. Generally, they have a letter from medical doctors saying that they have a need for an emotional support animal. However, if you think about it, their emotional support animal, which is an animal that they can have in an apartment or in a housing situation, they're evacuating. And what could be more stressful for a person with an emotional disability than an emergency situation? And so the law is evolving, but it's generally a best practice to allow somebody with an emotional support animal into a shelter as well. Separating them from their emotional support animal is not going to help them in an emergency situation. Certainly you can keep animals and their owners in a separate part of a shelter than if you have somebody that's got a pet allergy. But generally, wherever a person with a disability who uses a service animal goes, that service animal is allowed to go with them. So Chapter 3 covers auxiliary aids and services. We've talked about some of those services: American Sign Language interpreters, real-time captioning or CART services, video relay services, and then we're going to also cover what auxiliary aids are available for people with disabilities to communicate effectively. A couple of examples of assistive technologies, or I call them assistive technologies. The toolkit refers to them as auxiliary aids. These are some common tools used by people with disabilities. You see the Zoom text screen magnifier, Dragon Naturally Speaking or Dragon Dictate, and then JAWS Screen Reader. You don't necessarily have to provide these assistive technologies to people with disabilities, but understand when they evacuate, they're going to want to bring their tools with them, and these are the tools that they use to access information. More and more, you're going to find that people with disabilities have a lot of these tools available on their smartphones. And as I say on here, technology makes life better for most members of our public, but it makes life possible for people with disabilities. For a person who's deaf, their smartphone may be their link or bridge to communications for their family and for their friends, and also the ability for them to communicate with a person in a shelter or get valuable emergency information. For a person who's blind, their smartphone may have the tools that they need to access the information in the shelter. They can fill out forms on their smartphone if they have assistive technology, and those forms were prepared to be fillable and accessible. But just like if you were to have a person with a wheelchair come up to a building that didn't have a ramp or a no-step entrance, it does no good for an individual with a disability to have these auxiliary aids if you don't do your part and ensure that your communications are accessible. So we need to make sure our facilities are accessible, but we also need to make sure our communications and documents are accessible. So common types of communication services, we talked about American Sign Language interpreters, and you can go to the DHHS website at HHSC. There's a link in the toolkit that can get you a list of interpreter agencies in your area. You can use both live interpreters and remote interpreters. If you're using a remote interpreting service, once again, it's a contracted service that you need to set up in advance, but it does require quite a bit of bandwidth. You can use an iPad or a tablet to link to a video remote interpreting service. However, if your cell towers are down and you don't have good 4G connectivity, you may not be able to use video remote interpreting. It's very bandwidth dependent, and in order to have the quality of understanding, it's got to be smooth, fluid American Sign Language. CART we talked about, that's a service that needs to also be planned for in advance. It's essentially like a court stenographer who's typing everything that's being said in a conversation in real time, and that captioning or text pops up on a screen. You can use a simple laptop computer and a projector to provide CART in a shelter or in a meeting like this, or broadcasters, of course, use CART services to provide captioning in real time during newscasts. Of course, video relay, I just covered that. It requires essentially a tablet and some proprietary software, and there are quite a few companies out there that provide video relay services. If you talk to the deaf community, it doesn't have the same quality as a live interpreter. Live interpreter is always preferred, but for specific jurisdictions, more rural areas where you may have trouble getting a live American Sign Language interpreter there, this is going to be better than nothing. CART we talked about already. It uses real-time captioning. Here in Austin, we use Texas Real-Time Captioning. They provide CART interpreting for all of our webinars that we do at the governor's office, and also when we hold public meetings, we have both committee members who are deaf and members of the public who come up to attend our meetings and testify, and so we'll provide a CART interpreting service during our meetings, and at the end of our meetings we can also get a transcript of everything that's said. What you can then do with that transcript is, if you want to upload your presentation to YouTube, you've already got the transcript and you can just sync it up with the video, so it solves that problem as well. It also assists my executive assistant with preparing meeting minutes as well. But CART, it does have a cost associated with it. It's generally priced out per minute, but it's generally more important to people who lose their hearing later in life. People who are deaf early on may use American Sign Language and can also benefit from CART, but remember, people who are deaf, English is not their native language. Their native language is American Sign Language, and so for people who are deaf since birth, they're going to understand ASL better than captioning. Chapter 5 is an interesting chapter, and this is one that Will advocated for. It's essentially regarded as a pull-out chapter, and I encourage you to share this with your first responders, your shelter managers, and folks in your jurisdiction that want to have an immediate guide for how to interact with specific types of functional and access needs. It gives you the interaction tips to know how to interact with a person who is on the autism spectrum when dealing in a stressful situation and helping them evacuate. As we mentioned, the concept of access and functional needs is not to make you an expert on all the different types of disabilities, but for you to understand how to interact with people who have low vision without needing to know their specific disease or disability that caused them to have low vision, or how to interact with people with hearing loss without needing to know about Usher's syndrome or whatever caused their hearing loss. And so this chapter is an excellent chapter that goes into specific techniques for interacting with an individual type of disability. Of course, we have a plug to a mobile app. All right, so encourage you to download both print Chapter 5, put it on your mobile app, but get it in the hands of people that are going to be out in the field interacting with people with disabilities. As I mentioned, when we do after action, we focus more on what went wrong than what went right, and more went right than not. But we always hear those isolated cases where somebody didn't understand how to interact with an individual with an intellectual disability, or family who had an individual with autism in a shelter, and a lot of misunderstanding about communication can be avoided by having your operational people have access to these tips. Finally, it's generally the goal of any professional, but especially for emergency management professionals, to be experts in your field. And every member of a team likes to be that indispensable individual that is the expert on the area that they're assigned to be. And Chapter 6 is the chapter where if you want to go from having a novice understanding of effective communications to taking a much deeper dive and being your team's expert on effective communications for people with disabilities, I encourage you to dive deeply into Chapter 6. Chapter 6 takes you to links outside of the toolkit where you can have much more greater understanding about different types of disabilities, gives you specific guidance on all of the communication tips we talked about, writing in plain language, people first communications and the philosophy of people first language. It gets into different types of auxiliary aids that can be used in shelters. So Chapter 6 is what I would refer to as the deeper learning chapter. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Will, who's going to talk about our other toolkit. Some of the content that's in our Effective Communications Toolkit also appears in the FNSS Toolkit. At the same time we updated the Effective Communications Toolkit, we made sure that all of the contact information and links in the FNSS Toolkit were updated as well. So you've got good information in both.
Thank you, Ron. So as we move into the Texas Functional Needs Support Services Toolkit, a little bit of background on this toolkit. It's been around since 2011, when it was first created. Kind of already touched base on how many of y'all have seen or utilized this, and not a whole lot. So part of our goal today is to really start emphasizing the capabilities of these materials so that we can meet the needs of that whole community downrange. The Functional Needs Support Services Toolkit has undergone a few iterations of review. I believe this is our 2.0 version as well, as Ron mentioned. The Governor's Committee on People with Disabilities spent a lot of time, money, and effort last year preparing for the Emergency Management Conference to update these toolkits. So it went from, I think, approximately 200 pages to about 145 pages. It's much more user-friendly in its development and its utility. So with that, we want to explore the toolkit today. We want you to explore the toolkit. We want you to explore the toolkit with your whole community partners so that we can, again, as a living document within the context of emergency management, update these tools and make them more effective and efficient to meeting the needs of the entire community. So part one of the toolkit goes into a couple things and a couple details. One, it's your emergency management planning assessment. Where are you in your emergency planning process? And have you integrated and reached out to that whole community and that disability population within your community to identify what their needs are? There's some guidance on planning for the inclusion of people with disabilities. Again, nothing about them without them, about us without us. An opportunity to engage those individuals to work through this process. And there is, under tab D, a statewide disability stakeholders list. Now that's an ever-changing tool. So some of the folks on there may have stepped up or stepped out. Look through that tool to help identify the Mayor's Committee on People with Disabilities in your area. Find those formal and informal advocates for disability groups in your area. The Houston-Harris County area has a very strong deaf community. They have strong deaf churches. So an informal opportunity to reach out to those leaders in the community to have conversation back and forth. So giving the opportunity to you all as planners to meet the needs and identify the conversation in context with those partners. We also have included selected county demographic and functional medical needs data. So what is the population we're talking about? As Ron mentioned, 1 out of 6 Texans has a disability. At some point in your life, whether it's you, a family member, or a friend, is going to have an impact to their ability to be supported and needing that opportunity for functional needs support services. It will happen. And as we have a population that is aging, we might see that happen more and more. So the demographic information, it comes from the American County Survey, as well as from some of the information identified through our public health service partners to help inform you on what does your county look like. The disability stakeholder contact spreadsheet is pretty comprehensive. Again, it's a snapshot in time, so look to partners on what the update information is. Has anybody gone to 211 and looked for that opportunity? Either phone call or going to the 211 website. They have information identifying different advocacy groups and organizations within the community to help your planning, inform your planning process. So utilizing this list, while this might be a little more stagnant, 211 maintains dynamic information on community partners in your area to engage that conversation and that resource. Ron mentioned Just Ask. Look for those opportunities. Host a community forum. Offer some coffee. Have that opportunity to just ask. When you ask those community members to be involved in your conversation, look at your effective communications toolkit so that when they show up, we can get the information from them. We have somebody who's deaf and hard of hearing, somebody who's blind or low vision. I've done a presentation for the Texas Deaf Blind Council, okay? So the end user is somebody who cannot see or hear me, unfortunately for them, right? Or maybe good for them. But I have to then communicate through a tactile interpreter, and as you may have noticed, I talk pretty fast. I had to slow down for them, making sure that there was a check and knowledge for understanding so that we could communicate the key information to them and have them take that opportunity to ask questions for clarification. Just ask with that engagement process. Look to partners, to parents of individuals with autism in your community. What's the best way within your shelter to help support that family unit? Does anybody have the answer? During Harvey, we started to hear a lot more of these conversations. Those are good conversations to have, but during the incident is not the time to have them. It is beforehand. It's the opportunity beforehand where we can strengthen our response activities. The planning tools include an ADA compliance checklist. Ron mentioned the built environment, making sure that there is access into those locations. We utilize a lot of non-governmental entities out there that may or may not meet ADA standards. So if we're going to host a community meeting at the church and that church has not gone about making sure that they have physical access into the sanctuary location, is that going to meet the needs of your community? Well, no. So looking at all of those tools of opportunity, the ADA compliance checklist to evaluate where you're hosting meetings, to evaluate your shelter operations. What about utilizing the restrooms? Are they ADA compliant? Again, as Ron mentioned, most of our governmental facilities are going to be that way, helping try and meet the needs of their community. But their answer cannot be, we don't support people with disabilities here. The answer needs to be, okay, how can we support people with disabilities within the context of this environment? There's a medical services, public health shelter checklist, so helping to evaluate the environment of that checklist, as well as temporary solutions for emergency shelter ramps, right? So again, going back, we have a shelter, it's going to work real well for us, but in order for people to gain access, they have to go up a flight of stairs. Well, our partners at Texas Baptist Men have identified how to build a just-in-time shelter ramp. That information is included in the toolkit. There's a lot of questions or concerns that happen during the operational context when we have a disaster. They are all opportunities to meet the needs of the individuals. And there is a solution. As emergency management, as public health, as partners in the community, when we have the conversations beforehand, we can apply those solutions more readily and rapidly during the disaster. But there are lots of solutions out there. So again, the toolkit is part of the opportunity to evaluate what those gaps are and see where you need to get. Evaluating facilities. So again, a comprehensive look and list. We brought in our partners for the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulatory Services to meet the Texas accessibility standards when we first built this toolkit. As a point of fact, Texas accessibility standards helped guide the update to the ADA standards for access into facilities. It was above and beyond the old ADA guidance. Now ADA has used a lot of those same tools, and they're pretty well the same at this point. Is that fair to say, Ron?
Yeah, Texas scope goes a little bit further. The Texas accessibility standards, for example, applies to churches in area with the exclusion of specific areas of worship. But the Justice Department said Texas accessibility standards are comparable to the ADA. It had to be certified.
So, frankly, Texas drives this conversation a lot of times. We do a good job of meeting the needs of our community when the disaster happens. We are now looking at the formalized process, the preparedness aspect of that to meet those needs. These tools have been asked for throughout the state, throughout the nation. We've done presentations for FEMA, the CDC, on this guidance as well. So again, just an opportunity to understand and model what we are already doing in Texas and applying it to the disaster situations. So as we evaluate the facilities, we have to evaluate comprehensively the facilities in their physical accessibility. Won't go through the laundry list with you, but as we work through the process, people need to have access to the feeding location, using the restroom. What about bringing in portable showers? Okay? We can use this shelter if we bring in portable showers. What do we have to think of as far as portable showers? Is that going to work for the whole community? Anybody ever seen a shower trailer? What do you have to use to get up into a shower trailer? Stairs, right? There are portable ADA accessible showers out there. They're pretty rare and they are pretty costly. And in a major disaster, those resources are likely going to get sucked up. Same thing for porta potties, right? So when we go to concerts and venues, we see porta potties, and there's the ADA porta potty that allow the opportunity for people to toilet. So again, reflecting on those opportunities. Don't just stop at that one part. What do we do if? How do we provide support for? We were helping in evaluating the evacuation process for last year's hurricane exercise. I think year before last, the Valley exercise that they conducted as a statewide exercise here in the state of Texas. And as they were evaluating, they were talking about bringing out the rolling stairways to put people on airplanes. Okay, is that going to work for the full population? No. So are we saying that individuals who have a mobility need are going to have to get on a bus to leave the valley and take an 8 to 16-hour bus ride instead of getting on that aircraft? No, we're not saying that either. We're looking for solutions. What is a way we can provide that support? Well, we'll use the traditional jetways when we have somebody who has a mobility need. Or we can work with the partners that are providing food services to those jets that have the lift capability. You put somebody who has a mobility need in that lift capability, you help provide them access to that aircraft. So equality and accessibility to that same opportunity for evacuation beyond the sheltering aspects. As we evaluate the facilities, again, referring and referencing the ADA physical access, and doing what you have to make it accessible. Again, looking for those tools and opportunities to help support the process. What about transportation? When we talk about paratransit, what does that mean? It's adaptive to help support people who have disabilities. Well, it depends. Again, let's reflect on the disability. Somebody who is deaf, low vision, what kind of paratransit do they need? How is that different than traditional transportation resources? Potentially not, right? So what is the access or functional need that somebody might have in order for them to need to have a different kind of transportation resource? Somebody who has a wheelchair, right? Potentially. Somebody who is in a bed, can't be moved from their bed without extensive resources. So the different capabilities and capacities. Referencing and looking at your transportation services in your community. Oftentimes we reflect on hurricanes. I think Harvey was an interesting hurricane because it was the most no-notice, just-in-time hurricane situation we've probably ever had. As you look at how it evolved and became a catastrophic storm in a short period of time. What about no notice? The tornado is coming in 5-15 minutes and now has impacted our community. What about that chemical hazard release? All of those issues we have to be prepared for. So the state of Texas is continuing to reflect back to our local partners on looking at organic, localized resources to help support your transportation opportunity. Who can we look to help support paratransit or transportation needs in your community? So the toolkit has the answers, right? It starts you down a path towards answers, I should say. What about your local school district? I come out of school-based emergency management. I did that here at Austin for 3 years, or for the Texas School Safety Center. They are moving a tremendous amount of individuals who have different types of disabilities on a day-to-day basis throughout the community. Have the conversation with those school districts. Are those resources going to be tasked to another operational mission, or could they be utilized locally to help support your paratransit need? Your local transportation processes. What kinds of tools and capabilities are available? And then you have to match that with the transportation need of the individual. Again, it gets complicated. It can be tricky. Do we need a kneeling bus so that individual with a wheelchair can get on? Do we need to have more access and capability? One of the things that we learned during Hurricane Harvey was looking at our Coach USA paratransit buses. What did paratransit mean for those Coach USA buses? Had the ability to support 2 wheelchairs, traditional wheelchairs. And transportation support for individuals who might have a wheelchair is beyond what you might traditionally have to be able to move if you have a broken leg. Some of those wheelchairs are specifically adapted to the breathing capability and the health of the individuals in the community. So again, identifying those needs and communicating the correct paratransit transportation resources.
One of the things that the ADA challenges agencies to do is make modifications to their policies and procedures to accommodate people with disabilities. And with paratransit, the federal requirement is just that it provides service along 3/4 of a mile of a bus route on either side. However, if people are being evacuated and are living in shelters or TSA hotel vouchers or even couch surfing with a friend or a family member, they may be outside of that 3/4 of a mile area but still have need for paratransit. So the toolkit is not going to explicitly tell you modify your policy to accommodate those people, but the overall philosophy is to think creatively to help people with their resilient recovery. Look beyond the letter of the law and go to the spirit of how can we help people with disabilities.
So transportation is not just evacuation, it's also supporting transportation from somebody who's in the shelter to getting their other needs met. Somebody who needs to go to dialysis. Again, reflecting on what that support need is for the correct transportation tool to get that individual to a dialysis center, to get access to that critical medical care if they need it. So it is complicated and complex, but again, the toolkit allows an opportunity to reflect upon some of those partners to begin your conversations with. We have shelter staffing recommendations. These are not requirements. Again, Harvey is a lesson learned on those locations of last resort. What if we were unable to get shelter staffing into a refuge of last resort and have to provide the immediate medical care, access and functional needs care for the individuals? We do the best we can with what resources we have. The toolkit, in conjunction with our partners in the disability community, is that opportunity as well to have those conversations beforehand. That means if you have a shelter or a refuge of last resort location that is inaccessible, it is cut off by water, and you're having communication or supporting an individual with access and functional needs there, let's say communication with somebody who's deaf and hard of hearing, and you're using a marker and a Big Chief tablet, that's the best that we have at that point in time. And we strive to get better throughout the rest of that response process and that sheltering process. The waterways are now open. We bring an interpreter service provider in, or we utilize the video remote interpreting services. We bring in additional shelter support. So in this area, we identify through the toolkit a couple highlighted sections that are integrated with or supportive of individuals with access and functional needs. Now, access and functional needs might include medical needs, direct medical care, personal assistive services and how we provide personal assistive services, food services, right? We can't all eat the same meals. So being thoughtful about how we support an individual who needs a low sodium diet and be able to support them in that shelter environment. Transportation team lead, we talked about transportation. That person is coordinating off-site support. So if we're going to take a school bus and move folks at that shelter to go downrange and maybe get their laundry done and taken care of, again, we need to find that accessible support and transportation for the individual who might have a mobility need or need additional transportation support. And of course, DME, durable medical equipment, consumable medical supplies, other medications, how do we coordinate that opportunity to make sure that those folks are having their needs met as effectively and efficiently as possible within the shelter environment? We're talking again about general shelter populations. Now, our general population includes people with disabilities, and we're supporting those folks in our general population shelters. And it takes opportunity, it takes conversation to get those needs identified and met. Again, the toolkit is helping us work through this process, including a rapid assessment triage form. So shelter placement. Is this an individual who needs acute, ongoing medical care? If that individual needs acute, ongoing medical care, like somebody who is coming out of a nursing home environment or a hospital environment, a general population shelter is not the proper location for them to go. That's where medical shelters are involved and engaged. But if we can help somebody who has diabetes meet that need within a general population shelter, and they can stay with their family members who can support them, stay with their community, we've enhanced their ability to recover. We've made them more self-sufficient, and we've made our shelter more self-sufficient. Working and engaging individuals in our shelter within that context and process of working together helps enhance that program. So the shelter placement forms helps through identifying that process. One example with a rapid assessment for triage, and this is for evacuation or reentry transportation planning. So again, going back to what are those transportation needs? Does the person need emergency medical treatment? Well, okay. Right now, they need emergency medical treatment. They need to be at a hospital. They shouldn't be headed towards a shelter. So initially evaluating that process. Somebody who has a mobility need, do they need medical care? Working through the kinds of support they might need, whether it's a paratransit vehicle, a regular bus, a medical bus, a litter bus, or potentially even an ambulance for ongoing medical support. Shelter placement guidance. Is there an acute medical emergency? Again, 911 hospital. Is it skilled nursing care required, moving folks to a medical shelter? Or is it just general medical support that we can identify and provide that provision within the context of a general population shelter? We cannot segregate our population based off individuals with disabilities. We cannot do it. Department of Justice is very clear in that. It is our obligation to our partners, to our communities, to try to support them in the location where they have the most independence. That is our goal. That is what the support of the toolkit is. It continues to work through the medical support and the shelter placement. Operational tools that are identified include medical services, durable medical equipment, consumable medical supplies, oxygen support. Now, this information includes contracts that the state comptroller has with these providers. You can find the providers in your area and follow along with state contracts. It also includes the federal GSA contracting standards. So again, the opportunity for local jurisdictions to use the toolkit to identify what kind of durable medical equipment needs they might have in their community, and then find those durable medical equipment providers. Again, timeliness in our emergency support process is critical, and that can be done at the local level more efficiently than moving requests up through our partners at the state level, where we might even have to reflect at the federal level. And if that individual needs that support immediately or within a certain time, it's going to be supported better through local resources. So again, there's tools, there's identified contacts, after hours contact numbers for these individuals based off of these contracts, because it could be an emergency, it could be an after hours situation. Again, utilizing the tool to be able to connect the resources, the capabilities and the capacities for the needs of our community at the local level with the community capacities and capabilities. Durable medical equipment to help define, it can include wheelchairs, walkers, bedside commodes, bariatric beds. It's basically anything that might be utilized to help support the medical needs of the individuals in the shelters, with the exception of consumable medical supplies, which is something that is consumed. DME is reused equipment and capabilities and capacities. Consumable medical supplies might include adult diapers. It might include hearing aids, oxygen, bandages, because we consume it, And then there's going to be the need to maintain a cache or ongoing support of those consumable
Hearing aid
supplies.
batteries, not hearing aids, yeah.
Hearing aid batteries, thank you.
Right.
What about power generation? Emergency power supply for life-sustaining DME. Now, do all of our shelters have a backup generator in place? Do some of your shelters have backup generators in place? Do you know the capabilities of your shelters? And again, meeting the needs of the community is, hey, we know that this shelter is a primary shelter. It's our primary opening shelter because not only does it meet accessibility standards, but it's got generated capability on site. So we can meet the emergency power needs for the individual with an O2 concentrator, an oxygen concentrator. So that's life-sustaining DME, but also reflecting back on the ability for individuals to be independent in those shelters. Ron mentioned the technology tools that are available by our individual mobile devices greatly enhances the ability for us to support each other and communicate back and forth. So if somebody shows up at a shelter and they have an iPhone and they need to charge their iPhone, do you think we can meet that need to help support their effective communication? I mean, somebody's going to have an iPhone charger, right? Or an Android charger. Now, you can build that into your cache of equipment as well, or you can be reasonable and look at that and say, let's keep it simple. When somebody walks in and when they are asking to charge their phone, they need to charge their phone to help support that communication process, we can do it. Or our emergency power generation is limited. We have limited capability to support that. Where do we put this individual so that their O2 concentrator is powered for their support? So they don't decompensate. They don't have to end up at our hospitals. We can support the environment within our shelters, and that helps support the public health and the hospital response for the rest of the disaster as well. Personal assistance services. So personal assistance services is the formal and informal services that enable children and adults to maintain their usual level of independence in a shelter setting. A lot of our folks might be at homes where they have adapted their home environment to be able to allow them to take care of themselves throughout the complex of daily living activities. That means they have a handlebar for their toilet and their shower to help them use the restroom and get cleaned off. That might not exist in your shelter operation. So having that formal or informal opportunity to engage with those individuals to help them through the process, to help them eat. They might not have the adaptive technology or tools, and somebody needs to support that individual so that they can eat, right? Now, this is sometimes the side of shelter operations that maybe we don't get into as much detail. We want to be the shelter managers. We want to help support individuals. Are you willing to wipe somebody's bottom? I'm a foster parent, so I do that all the time. I always say yes, right? That's unglamorous, but it helps support that individual, helps support those individuals in your shelter. So again, looking at those opportunities. Also, within the toolkit, reflecting on being able to connect the individuals that have home health care providers that go into their homes and provide them with their personal assistive services, their activity of daily living support, and getting them reconnected at the shelter. Because guess what? Those folks don't get paid unless they're connected back to the folks at the shelter, and that's their job. They understand and know Will, Uncle Joe, whoever that might be, better than anybody else. And they can provide those services within the shelter context. So when we identify the home health care, which is included in the toolkit, with the services of individuals that they are already providing for, we're helping to ensure that those individuals' needs are being met in the most effective and efficient way as possible. Now, we also ask as people come in our tools and our shelter evaluation forms, do you have a home health care provider? If the answer is yes, okay, let's get that information written down. We're going to call them and tell them they're at this shelter. We've already gotten some things accomplished because they, by a regulatory rule, are required to provide that services where they are identified. An example of a list of adult daily living activities, it goes back to, again, functional support. Somebody has a functional need. Now, this might be a full-time individual at your shelter. You are unable to find a home health care provider that's working directly with Uncle Joe on a day-to-day basis. It could be that you have one individual that comes in and they can help a number of different folks with their grooming and eating and toileting. Doesn't necessarily need to be one-on-one, but looking for that opportunity to provide that support and service in a timely way. And again, that's the unglamorous side of shelter operations. It's what we have done as Texans in shelters for the last 20 years. Doesn't matter what disaster. Now we're able to look at it beforehand, better educate our volunteers, and better be prepared to get those services readily identified back to the individuals that they serve. Additional medical services that we need to provide, and this doesn't have to be on site, okay? It is access to. So, disaster behavioral health services. Would it be good to be able to have a psychiatrist on site at every one of our shelters to provide direct care? Yeah, that would be fantastic. Is that going to happen? Not necessarily. But being able to provide access to these resources is critical. Pharmacy support. We know some of our for-profit partners, our private sector partners, have gone into shelters and set up their own pharmacies, right? And that has been very successful. The pop-up shelter is probably not going to have it. Do those people need medication and support? The answer is yes. So we can provide transportation. We can coordinate through those private sector providers to get the resources necessary on site. And kidney and dialysis support, right? We're not going to set up a dialysis center in our shelters. Had an interesting conversation about this very thing last week. We're not going to do that because it's not a sanitary condition. That's going to put those individuals at risk. Are we going to look for dialysis centers in the community to help support that? Absolutely. During Harvey, we started to see this pretty early, right? People decompensate rapidly if they don't get dialysis. That's going to put them in life-threatening condition after 2 or 3 days. So know where your dialysis centers are beforehand. Evaluate the transportation capability between your shelters and those dialysis centers, and again, communicate those needs to the individuals in the shelter. Make sure that's being a comprehensive and effective communication. Somebody who's deaf and needs to have dialysis, how do we make sure that their needs are being met? That's a conversation. Our plans need to reflect on understanding of all state and local rules and laws as they apply to medical support, mental health services support, emergency dental services, medications. That doesn't mean that we're taking everybody to the dentist to get their routine cleaning. We're saying that that individual was pulled off the roof of their house, and as they came off the roof of their house, they fractured their jaw and have issues that they need to get immediate dental support. So again, looking at the needs of the individual and helping to coordinate within the community aspect. And we do this, again, all the time. It's going to be more overwhelming when the Harvey situation happens. It's going to be an impact when that particular shelter or last resort location is impacted as well. But doing the best we can, identifying the needs, and then at the shelter, being able to triage and communicate those needs back up through your local emergency management, right? Potentially back to the state, working through our emergency management process. I've had a lot of conversation about communication. This is another point of emphasis within the toolkit. It's like the Chapter 5 that Ron mentioned in the Effective Communication Toolkit. It's a section you can pull out, have a hard copy printed off, lay down so you can help support individuals with communication at that specific site. Whether that's oral interpreters, notepads and pens, again, getting back to that situation where we may not be able to pull in an interpreter. We may not be able to pull in somebody who can provide translation. Well, can we all do some charades? Right? Have you eaten today? Have you eaten today? Because some people who come into that location might think they have to pay for food at the shelter. That's happened before too. People who are deaf have gone into a shelter think they have to pay for food, not knowing that's a free service. So again, using pictograms, engaging folks, your folks being aware of what people are doing. Have they eaten? Have they not eaten yet? Why? I wonder why. What is the need that they have that we haven't gotten to them? Because if they don't eat after a couple days, what do you see again? Decompensation, medical response. The Effective Communication Toolkit, again, goes through a lot of the details with talkboards and pictograms. The pictograms were developed by a partner, Department of State Health Service, that use the international standard. They're really pretty good. They can be utilized for points of distribution as well as for shelter operations. Take a look at them. Again, it's available. Print it out beforehand, have it readily available. Pictograms can be that universal language identifier. They use them at the Olympics. Use it at our shelter. The toolkit also rolls into recovery. So we do the evaluation of the needs of the individual before they get on our evacuation transportation resources. We do an evaluation as they enter into our shelters, identifying what their needs might be. And then there's the opportunity for us to evaluate their capability to go back to the community from whence they came. One is the medical and functional needs discharge assessment. So that's an assessment of the individual. What is their need? Are they ready to go back to their community? And then two, it's identifying the capabilities of the community post-disaster, and are they able to take back their whole community? So the transition and recovery document helps to identify those capabilities and resources. There's not power in the area. Maybe they're setting up a shelter to support individuals, but there's not power, and somebody is medically fragile or prone to having issues if they are too hot. All right, it's Texas, it's summer in Texas, a hurricane just came through, there's a couple pleasant days usually right thereafter, and then it gets really hot again. So maybe they cannot go back to their community. So effectively looking at and evaluating their capabilities, community capabilities and the needs of the individual. As we finish up with the toolkit, there's additional training videos identified there. There's American Sign Language preparedness videos for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Ron mentioned that FEMA had developed this for Hurricane Harvey. I'd like to brag a little bit about state of Texas. Deaf and hard of hearing services for the state of Texas, along with the Department of State Health Services, had developed preparedness videos using individuals who are deaf, so it is Native American Sign Language, back in 2012. That information is available on Texas Prepares. Not Preparing Texas, Texas Prepares. It's the DSHS site. .org. Yeah. TexasPrepares.org. So that's available for individuals for their preparedness activities. Just Ask is a great video on blind assistance. Walks an individual through the Austin airport. Somebody who is blind or low vision. Just ask, hey, is there something I can help you with? The answer might be no. They don't have an access or functional need. Or they might need initial wayfinding in the shelter to find the bathroom, but after the initial time or two, they can now find their own way. So being helpful, being cognizant of the capabilities of those individuals, and having the conversations. The toolkit resources, again, are on Preparing Texas, our nice QR code. There's a couple training resources that are also identified and provided there we want to go over. There's an instructor guide and slides on Preparing Texas to utilize the FNSS toolkit. So you can take this presentation, integrate it into your conversations, and start utilizing it. We need to enhance the opportunity for this communication to our planning partners. And then we ask those planning partners to, as an obligation for their community, to communicate back and identify those resources and capabilities, capacities, gaps, and concerns of their community. Additionally, our partners at DSHS have built an FNSS General Population Shelter computer-based training that's available on their train system, so that's tx.train.org, and with the course number here. So you can go on there, take the training through Train for utilizing the FNSS toolkit to support a general population shelter. Again, some information on the instructor guide and slides, that nice clear QR code. It's available through Preparing Texas website, and again, a direct link to that Train course. So with that, it really brings us to the end of the formal presentation.
I guess I would say in closing, this seems like a daunting amount of information. We're not asking you to become experts on all disabilities that are out there. As I said, it's a philosophy that asks you to look at how to functionally assist people with disabilities. And so you don't need to be an expert on Down syndrome or autism. You just need to know how to help people with an intellectual disability or somebody who's having a stressful situation in a shelter. And the toolkit is reference material. You're not going to read it like a novel, but you do need to become familiar with it before the next disaster. A lot of this is going to spark conversations within your jurisdiction, conversations with broadcasters, conversations with your county judge or mayor's chief of staff for communications, the communications manager. Make sure that they are planning in advance to keep that American Sign Language interpreter in the camera shot. You all do your best work when you're planning and you're preparing and not reacting. And these tools, I read it again cover to cover just to get ready for this presentation, and I was taken away by this is really great information, but only if we use it.
Thanks, Ron. I think.
Sure.